Hi everyone, my name is Deb Randall, Radware Marketing Director. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Cybersecurity Pushed to the Limit. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the bottom of your screen are multiple widgets. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type them into the Q&A box and submit the question to our speaker. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you during the webinar, we may follow up via email. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the chat widget and we'll be happy to help you. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available roughly 24 hours after the event concludes and then can be accessed using the same audience link. I would now like to turn the event over to Ron Woodward, our security evangelist.
Hi everybody, good afternoon, good morning. As Deb said, my name is Ron Woodward. I'm on the Global Evangelist team here at Radware, and today is one of our webinars that we do for our monthly webinar series. Today we are going to talk about the cybersecurity threat landscape. The title of our presentation is Cybersecurity Pushed to the Limit, and we are going to review our data from our annual security report. Before I worked with Radware here, I was also a customer of Radware, and I followed this data pretty closely to compare how my network compared to the results that Radware was publishing, basically what other people were seeing as well. So please, as we're going through the content today, think about how this resonates with you and inside of your network, and feel free to ask any questions as they pop up. Ultimately, we will probably address them at the end. So today we are going to talk about trends. What are we seeing? You know, what has happened between 2016 to 2017 and partly into 2018? You know, what has changed in the threat landscape? And actually a whole lot has changed, so we will get into a lot of these. Vectors and changes that have happened in how people are attacking our networks. We'll go through this. What are the business concerns? What are people concerned with when trying to defend their networks? And you know, how does this resonate and compare with your own challenges as well? Finally, we'll look what's coming next, and then predictions and just a summary of what we've discussed today. So as I say, this is empirical data that comes out of research that we conduct every year as part of our annual security report. This data comes from 1,250 respondents. They are globally distributed, multiple verticals, different types of scopes and size of the business. So as you can see here, we have a good distribution of global respondents, and we have different businesses and different sizes and scopes of these businesses. Now, a 5-person startup has a very different security challenge and security posture than a 10,000 employee multinational corporation that's been in business for 20 years, right? So we think that it's a good representation of the different needs and challenges that people face throughout. The second source of this data, a lot of this will come from research or our teams defending the network, what we call our ERT, Emergency Response Team Threat Research Center. So if you think about equipment that is defending against attacks, you think if you were to compare those to a fighter jet, the ERT team is like your fighter pilots, so the people who are able to precision, you know, control and conduct advanced work and protections on these very precision instruments. Among this team comes people who are defending networks. There come darknet researchers. There are threat analysts. Lots of information and resources go into the discovery of these threats. So first, let's take a look at the global trends, and some of this stuff may resonate with you as well. Of course, cryptocurrency. You know, we saw the rise in the value of Bitcoin. There is a increasing trajectory as well with ransom as a motivation behind attacks. So you can see here, we've been tracking this since 2014. Ransom has been behind 50% of the motivation of attacks over this past interval. Year over year, we've seen a growth in 40% as the motivation of why people are attacking networks. We can see that ransom continues to be an attractive reason why people attack us. 1 out of 8 organizations had experienced a DDoS extortion attempt or attack. So remember, we had copycat ransom attackers, so people who were basically just sending emails saying, you've probably seen these attacks, you're the next victim, send me X amount of Bitcoin to this address or you're going to get attacked. So we had real ransom, and then we had copycat ransom, and of course we had ransom for malware, and this is not new information. What is interesting is the growth rate of ransom as why people attack networks. It's also one of the top security concerns for people reported for this year. So here are a few data points that demonstrate this challenge. 45% of people have suffered some sort of a data breach. That's an alarming number. Almost 1 out of 2 companies have had some sort of a data breach. 30% of the time, a customer will ask for something in return for an event following a data breach. Maybe that is compensation, maybe it's a lawsuit, maybe they are asking for some sort of way to make it better for them, for example. 28% of the time, people say data theft was their #1 security challenge. Although we have passed the GDPR date, which was May 25th, 72% of people going into this year were not prepared for GDPR, which I think that we all understand that a lot of that stuff was accelerated as well in terms of people kind of scrambling to get prepared for this. I guess it will remain to be seen how prepared people truly are. Another data point, 26% of the time people say that data protection is their top concern. 16% of the time people plan to invest more in protecting their data for 2018. So IoT has forever changed our security threat landscape. IoT, and specifically the release of the Mirai botnet in 2016, I personally say that this is probably the most monumental thing to happen in cybersecurity in at least the most recent years, but potentially even more impactful than that. IoT, these devices that are always on, poorly secured, poor authentication. Hackers, of course, have determined that they can exploit these, and they present a tremendous risk for us. When we've asked people who is accountable for these risks, the decision is mixed. Some people say that the people who are building the devices, they are the ones who are responsible for making sure these are implemented safely. Other people say that the business, the people who are deploying them, they are responsible for making sure this happens. People say that consumers, they're the ones who are responsible if you're deploying them in home. And most of these IoT devices historically are deployed in the home. So that's another threat. Only 11% of people feel that it's the service provider. Some of that argument is that if you were to equate the threat to spam, service providers have procedures for blocking spam. And so some of the argument there in the industry is that people who are being paid to attach customers to the internet should also be responsible for their security. So that's where this landscape is made up from. Now, have people experienced IoT botnet attacks? 1 out of 6 people say that they did receive an IoT attack in 2017. Finally, when we ask people, well, what is your greatest fear when integrating these IoT devices into the network? It is far and above the difficulty in managing the security of these devices is the reason, or is the greatest concern that people have. And look, we've had IoT, we have botnets now that are exploiting CPE at internet service providers in their infrastructure. And here are people who are well-versed, well aware of implementing devices securely, and even those things are being exploited. So this is a challenging issue, it really is. The rise of botnets. So we have seen, when we ask people, what does the makeup of your web traffic look like? For some organizations, they say that 75% or more of their traffic is bot traffic. Now, that's not necessarily IoT attackers, right? It can be good bots or bad bots. For example, a good bot might be maybe you are in the travel industry, and maybe a bot is collecting information for price, comparisons, kind of things. That could be determined as a good bot, for example. A bad bot would be somebody who's stealing that information. Or let's look at some of these examples. DDoS attacks, of course, but web scraping attacks. So a bot that is going in and just collecting everything that it can that is publicly available, and then using that for recon and competitive information, for example. Radware has a customer who is a major airline in the U.S. who is suffering an ongoing attack where a bot is going in and they're reserving high-priced airline seats on their website and holding them in inventory and holding them, but never checking out and completing the process. While that is happening, those seats are unavailable for other real legitimate users to go ahead and purchase. So that is a financial attack being used to hold inventory and manipulate pricing, for example. Another example is people have determined that they can use these devices to mine cryptocurrency. And in fact, some of them have even gone in and attacked other cryptocurrency miners and replaced the crypto wallets with the targets of the crypto wallets with their own. So this is a very complex world for these IoT bots. One of the things that we have seen, and you may have heard about this as the cause of some of the attacks this year or the breaches this year, but you absolutely will continue to hear about it, is API vulnerabilities. APIs are interfaces into a network for an external party or resource to go ahead and implement some kind of, execute some kind of code or look up some kind of information, specifically built to allow external access. Now let's look at some of the information that we've looked at here. When we ask people, do you analyze API vulnerabilities prior to integration? 51% of the time, people do not analyze these vulnerabilities for APIs. So about 1 out of 2 are doing them without discovering if they are bad. 60% of the time, people share and consume sensitive data via APIs. So A, we're not checking to see if there are vulnerabilities, but B, 60% of the time, we're sharing important information. And then 52% of the time, people aren't even inspecting the data that is being transferred through an API. So a lot of the breaches that are happening, API is one of the factors in that. So this really underscores the need for API gateways, web application firewall. That's the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about for API vulnerabilities. So how have the attacks in the network changed? What has changed in the threat landscape? In the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I was a customer before joining the team. This is some of the data that I tracked every year that this report was out. So think about this and how this compares to you. We have seen that application attacks have overtaken network-based attacks as the #1 attack. So 37% of the time, attacks were HTTP, so attacks on websites, versus network-based like SYN flood attacks, type of reflection attacks, these kind of things. 1 out of every time an attack happened, it exceeded 1 gigabit per second. I, being an engineer background and data kind of nerd, I like to analyze data and what this means. To me, this means that 80% of the time, so 4 out of 5, an attack is what we would call subrate, below 1 gigabit per second. And what that does is presents the opportunity for local protections. So if 80% of the time I can defend attacks locally on my infrastructure or in the data center and obtain a device that has a smaller interface capacity, smaller processing at a lower price, that's interesting. And then I can rely on a upstream partner or a hybrid type model or a cloud-based partner to handle that extra attack that could be over 1 gigabit per second. So interesting data. When we ask people, how confident are you to handle these types of different attacks, where the orange bars here are application layer attacks and the blue bars are network-based attacks? Let's take a look. I mean, 44% of the time, people have no confidence in the ability to defend against application layer attacks. This is also web application firewall is what you want to be thinking about here. So we seem to be able to handle network-based DDoS attacks pretty well, but the concern here for people is application layer attacks. DNS was a major change, also because of the Mirai botnet attacks and the inclusion of a DNS-specific attack in the Mirai source code. A brute force attack, that is not really specific to Mirai. A brute force attack is really just recon or guessing actual host names for a domain and then using that to then further probe what the devices might be. But these query floods and recursive floods, these are the types of attacks that have always existed but are also now included in the Mirai source code. So they are very difficult to defend against. And even protecting against them is difficult without the right equipment to do so. So when we ask people, what do you think about these emerging vectors? Permanent denial of service. 7% of people experienced a permanent denial of service in 2017. 15% of people are concerned with them in 2018. Permanent denial of service is the concept of an attack that once it is executed on you, you cannot recover from. A good example of this is a botnet called BrickerBot that was discovered by Radware. My colleague in the EMEA region, Pascal Keenan, is attributed as the person who discovered this. So BrickerBot is a botnet that is specifically designed to destroy vulnerable IoT devices by formatting the file system and repartitioning the file system, deleting IP routes off of them, deleting default routes, all kinds of different things that are permanently destroying these devices. SSL-based attacks. This I like. This is just in terms of general health of the industry and awareness. I like that 57% of people are concerned with this in 2018. I would like that to be higher, but I think that it shows maturity and forward thinking and awareness of what's happening. IoT botnets, I'm interested in the fact that this is kind of low. 16% of people experienced these attacks in 2017, but only 13% of them are aware of or concerned with them in 2018. And then finally, 42% of people experienced burst attacks in 2017, but only 10% of people are aware of them or concerned with them in 2018. These two last topics, to me, are more of a concern. Like, I think that these are the threats. These are the things that are for us in security. These are the challenges. These are the hardest things to defend against. And the fact that people are not as concerned with them is a little bit concerning as well. So please give some thought to this for yourselves as well. Bot attacks. So using these IoT devices, for example, and they don't always have to be IoT, but that creates a tremendous opportunity to do so. There is IoT code that can use these devices for HTTP proxies, for example, or just scraping data and funneling that back to a source. So I mentioned earlier, 2 out of 5 report bot traffic exceeds 75% of their traffic. 44% of people can't tell the difference between bots and a flash mob, for example. So here are some of the things that people have cited as the impact of bots on their network. This is concerning. 56% of the time, people say that intellectual property, such as pricing, is stolen by bots on their network. So, if this resonates with you, also web application firewall. You can do things like known attackers feed that can be fed into perimeter devices, for example. So a lot of different options which you can pursue to do this, to protect against these. Again, back to the data that I loved to compare against for myself. This network map, also one of the best things that I have tracked as a customer. This is a analysis of a typical network and where failure points happen. And it speaks to trends of networks, it speaks to trends of attacks, but let's go through it. 37% of the time, over the last survey cycle, the internet pipe is the point of failure. So basically saturating an internet link with a volumetric attack, 37% of the time. Last year, that was about 25% of the time, I think. So we have this number has fluctuated, but we are up from the previous year by 50%. The next 2 points I want to really hit on. 17% of the time it's the firewall, and 6% of the time it's the IPS or IDS. Now really what we're saying here is that 23% of the time, the equipment that we are buying to keep our network safe is the point of failure when under attack. Now the reason for this is that these devices are typically stateful devices, and their job is to keep track of who's coming in and out of the network and basically store that in a session table or a state table, for example. And those are common vectors to be exploited and beaten or overcome with attacks. So the way to protect against that is also put a device in front of them, like a perimeter-based protection device, like our Defense Pro, that can be deployed stateless and not have to worry about the connection, can protect against connection exhaustion. And then the rest further into the network, it's what you would expect. So looking at this, facts about different verticals. 40% of the time, we mentioned this, retailers say that bot traffic is 75% of their total traffic. This is interesting to me. 42% of educations actually fear availability issues over data theft or reputation loss. And if you think about this, the education networks have changed tremendously over the past 5 years. Coursework is online, remote classes. So much of this is the curriculum is focused around the network that it becomes availability becomes a major driver of it. 31% of the time, service providers intend to invest in DDoS mitigation for 2018. This is kind of interesting. This point, 24% of the time, government or public sector have daily attacks. This one, highly concerning to me as an individual. 73% of the time, healthcare express low to medium confidence in securing patient records. I mean, that's highly alarming to me as just a citizen and a consumer. And then 44% of the time, financials don't track data they don't look on the darknet for their data after a breach, which is exactly where the data is going. So let's see what's, let's look at business concerns and see what is on the mind of security professionals through this term, through 2018. The biggest concerns when people are attacked: data leakage and information loss, 28% of the time. Fewer people were concerned with revenue loss. I went through and looked through at this information and how this compared to previous years. And I went back because I remember as a customer that the top concern many years ago, which happened to be 2014, was reputation loss. So in 2014, the top concern, 47% of people, reputation loss was their #1 concern after attacks. This speaks to also a maturity in the landscape, right? So reputation loss is still third, but the awareness that availability and data leakage, is more of a threat to them speaks to the maturity of the landscape, I think. The cost of a cyber attack. When we asked people, were you attacked, and have you estimated what that attack cost you, compared to were you attacked and what did it cost you, we found that people basically underestimate the cost of what an attack cost them. So let's say that they assume that an attack cost them $100,000. In reality, it would have cost them, the people who did get attacked, it would have cost them $200,000. So the data point here, or the takeaway, is that when people are attacked and people suffer some sort of attack, they're underestimating, they're off by at least 50% of what the true cost of the fallout of the attack is. So what happens after some sort of cyber attack? And think about this as a consumer or as a business. Many of your service providers all have SLAs. So this is in line and kind of makes sense with what's happening. But we're asking people after DDoS downtime, have you done any of these? 13% of the time they're asking for compensation. You can think about that like an SLA credit, for example. Pretty common if your providers don't meet their SLAs. 5% of the time it's a lawsuit, 12% of the time it's customers leaving. Similar numbers for data breach and malware contamination or issues, but there is an impact, as we can see, to having an outage in the network. We also are having to answer to our customers is basically what's happening in this slide. When we ask people, what kind of data do you share with third parties, we can see 72% of the time people are sharing usernames and passwords with third parties. 1 out of 2, they're sharing payment details with third parties. 40% of the time, 42, it's PII information, and then 32% of the time it's user behavior or maybe metadata or analytics, preferences, these kind of things. And as we can see, 47% of the time in the bullet here, there's not encryption being used to do this. So what we see is that organizations are not really taking the security measures that they need to keep us as consumers, our information safe. Most people feel that they can handle the OWASP top 10 type of attacks pretty well. Layer 7 DDoS is the #1 concern for people, followed by encrypted attacks, API manipulations, and data breaches. I think that this is good. This is good data. This is good awareness. But it's good to understand that the OWASP we think about in web application firewall. We think of OWASP top 10 as the benchmark, and there are lots of other things to think about, right? So this is interesting data to watch. I like this information. So frequency of application changes or new releases. What we're asking people is, are you implementing changes into your infrastructure, maybe application or a website, something like that? How quickly are you doing it? And the reason for looking at this is how frequently are people making changes in their network? And is security top of mind when this is happening? So half of the applications, people say that they undergo weekly changes. For 2017, we can see 12% of the time it's daily changes on their application. 8% of the time it's multiple times a day. So if you compare 2016 to 2017, we can see that the velocity of daily changes and more frequent changes is increasing. And the relevance here is that security has to be right every single time. Every single time that a change is made, security has to be right. That's a lot of weight to carry on your shoulders without the right protections to also back up the infrastructure. And again, web application firewall is kind of what you want to be thinking about here. A couple more data points. 30% of the time people will hire hackers in their security team. They could be white hat hackers, like there's the certified ethical hacker type program. They don't necessarily have to be accredited, but if you know about them, at Radware we hire darknet researchers and people who have hacking backgrounds. All right. So 30% of the time people will do that. I think that you will see more of that change. This is interesting. 41% of people trust the employees in their organization. That means most of us are not trusted by the security teams in our organizations, which makes sense. It's just funny to say that, but trust but verify, for example, or don't trust because maybe there's risk assumed with trust, but just an interesting number. 33% of the time, people do not have an incident response plan in place. This is very interesting to me, and the reason is that you might not have a single dollar in your security budget or in any budget to spend on security. But what you can do is think about what will happen in the event that something goes wrong. Or if you are involved in an attack or a data breach, will you involve internal counsel, external counsel? Will the C-suite be involved? Will you be engaging people in social media? You really don't want to be figuring this stuff out on the fly when it's happening, because that's where people make mistakes. Even if you don't have a single dollar in your budget to spend on security, have an incident response plan and know what you're going to do if it happens. Next bullet, 68% of people are not confident in their security posture. Because of the next bullet, for 36% of people are expressing a limited understanding of blockchain. We put that in there just to kind of, because of all of the cryptocurrency talk, I think that's very high. I would say that probably 36% of people have heard of blockchain. Certainly not. The rest are saying that they fully understand it. This is interesting. 25% of the time people report an application exploit attempt every week. So what's happening? What are people? What's coming up through the next couple months? Ransom and data theft are seen as the two biggest threats. When we ask people what are your most difficult to prevent or detect, ransom attacks, data theft. These are the concerns that people have, and I would say compare this to your own posture as well. When we ask people how will they spend their money, 28% of the time they will hire in-house expertise or application infrastructure. 26% of the time, endpoint and malware protection is where they'll spend. SIEM, security analytics, 20% of the time. DLP, 16% of the time, and DDoS protection is 10% of the time. This is in here again so that you can compare where you stand with what other people have reported. Using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Very interesting. I talk a lot about this topic in other presentations, but 20% of the time people are relying on machine learning or AI-based technologies. 28% of the time they plan to rely on it, or they plan to integrate it, and just about 1 out of 2 are not using it. When we ask people why they will use it, better security is the #1 concern, far and above everything else. And this is true. If you think about the ability to use machines to look for patterns and event analysis, this is really a strength of machines in terms of protecting. Now, there are some concerns, and we can get into that. And in fact, there are other presentations in the webinar series that do deep dives on this discussion. But the overall takeaway is that you are more secure with a a machine learning or AI-based environment that can help you make decisions. So summary and predictions. What has happened? Where are we going? Now, this information is released in the beginning of the year. Some of this stuff has come true. Some of it we'll see. So let's take a look. Weaponizing artificial intelligence. We predicted in the beginning of the year that we will see bots and AI being used to attack, and that has absolutely happened. There's a whole thing called the Cyber Grand Challenge, which was 2016, but it was the concept of machines, basically AIs attacking each other and being used to also protect and patch their own vulnerabilities. And then we dive in a couple months later and a couple weeks later, and there are examples of presentations where people are using AI to, like for example, neural networks to dump an entire SQL database, for example. That happens. So this is more and more on our radar and more of a threat to us. APIs being a double-edged sword. APIs are drivers of this digital economy that you and I enjoy as consumers and people on the internet, right? So much happens because of APIs, but APIs also present risk, and we showed data points where people are sharing information that is not being checked for vulnerabilities and not being encrypted. These are a threat to us as citizens and customers of companies, right? Attacking via proxies. So the concept here was that we will see more of a Mirai type attack that was against Dyn, for example, where you're attacking something in the middle that has a larger collateral damage. This continues. I mean, just think about the number of apps that you'll see. Every now and then you'll see a study or a news article that says this many apps were removed from this vendor's app store, for example, because of vulnerabilities. Or just I think last week there was an example of the source code of one of the Linux distributions potentially being corrupted because it's being stored in a public repository. So that's what we mean by attacking via proxies or water hole type of attacks. Automated social engineering, using bots to, these devices are already collecting information. It won't be long before we can use algorithms and neural networks, for example, to decide how to use this for nefarious reasons. There was an example of I forget, it was called Snapr, S-N-A-P-R, and it was a study of a Twitter bot that was being used for advanced phishing campaigns, and the AI-based system was far more advanced and better at luring people in for its phishing campaign than a human was, and it could do it with higher accuracy and faster than a human could. So that's kind of where that's going. So what can you do? Consolidate and automate. Look to a single vendor, less devices that can do more. This is where you will see gains in protections. Versatile application protections. You have to remember that protect things on your premise, protect things on your cloud, have the ability to protect both. Be sure understand who you are using to protect this information, and understand what the capabilities of your partners for both environments. Fighting fire with fire, using AI to fight AI. This speaks to the using AI or machine learning behavioral type defenses against the AI or machine learning type of attacks that are being implemented on networks today. This is a tool that you want on your side because it's hard to do, almost impossible to do if you're always reacting to an attack. And then finally, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Have an emergency response plan, read industry articles, visit our monthly webinar series, for example. Everything that is even though they are also live, anything in the past is recorded and archived. Do your research and just keep track of what's happening in the industry, because things are changing so fast, and you will be better prepared if you are understanding what the threat landscape looks like than if you're not tracking what's happening. So, and here is finally a link of where you can go to download the actual PDF version of this document. It's a good document. As I say, I tracked it for years as a customer before joining the company, and it's full of tremendous information that's I always found to be useful, and I hope that you do too. So with that, I will open it up for any questions. Okay, I don't see any additional questions other than ones that were answered directly by the additional Radware staff while the chat was happening. So I would like to thank you for your time today. I appreciate that you joined us. If you missed any part of this or want to go back through, the session, as Deb said, will be available archived. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if we can dive into any of this further. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you again. Excuse me. Thank you for your time and participation today. We hope you can join us for our future webcasts. As I mentioned, the recording will be available in roughly 24 hours using the same link you used to join today's session. Thank you and have a great day.